Sometimes I'll see a Slack message. As per my last email, sick. We all know exactly what that means. Are you paying attention? Can you not read? The words themselves are perfectly polite, but the actual intent is not so polite. What about when a manager gives you a shit sandwich? They wrap one tiny piece of criticism in so much fluff and HR-approved jargon that you walk out of that meeting and have no idea if you're getting a promotion or getting fired. We do this all the time. We use language as a shield. We use it to deflect, to sound smart, to be passive-aggressive, or just to avoid an uncomfortable truth. As adults, we sometimes completely forget the most basic rule that we teach toddlers. Just use your words and say what you mean. If you think this is just a modern problem, it's really not. 2.5 millennia ago, Confucius was dealing with the exact same thing. He was surrounded by political climbers and smooth talkers who were absolute masters at using beautiful, polished language to hide their own greed and incompetence. Confucius thought this was a disaster. To him, the moment you stop using words to actually connect with people and start using them to play games, you break a very important social contract. Today, we're looking at a tiny 5-character phrase from the Analects that cuts right through the noise. It's a 2,500-year-old reminder of what language is actually for. Exploring the Analects, Episode 4, Passage 15.41. Use your words. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 4 of Exploring the Analects. Today we'll be talking about Passage 15.41 of the Analects, a 5-character phrase in which Confucius comments on the purpose of language. I'd like to give a brief introduction to the series before we hop into the quote. This podcast focused on the Analects, a collection of hundreds of passages about the philosophy and teachings of Confucius. These passages were written and compiled by followers of the Confucian Way in China between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. They touch on a whole range of topics that can still teach us how to live our lives today, and they vary in length from just a few syllables to several paragraphs long. We're starting with the shortest passages first, so the phrases in these early episodes are just 4 or 5 characters long. In each episode, I introduce the passage, give an informal translation, read the Chinese, then provide a more faithful translation. Then we talk about the meaning of the quote with historical and cultural notes, after which I discuss language points for students of Chinese. Finally, I comment on the passage's place in the Analects, as well as any varying interpretations that might not have fit in elsewhere. Now that that's covered, let's jump in and take a look at the quote. As I just mentioned, I'll start off with an informal interpretation of 15.41. Don't expect it to stick too closely to the Chinese, but do expect it to capture something about its spirit. I want the modern phrasing and subject matter to give you something to hang your hat on as we dive deeper into the subject. And today is a bit of a special one. I'll be quoting a song from the children's show, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Use your words, use your words. Use your words and say how you feel. Most problems can be solved when you use your words, so use your words and say how you feel. Next, I'll read the quote in modern Mandarin,
then follow up with a more faithful translation into English from Professor Edward Slingerland's book, Analects, with selections from traditional commentaries. 子曰：辞达而已矣. The master said, words should convey their point, and leave it at that. This is a statement about how we should use words. Words should be used to bridge the gap between minds. If the idea is successfully communicated, if the message gets through, that's enough, because that is what words are for. Just as important is the implication that there are many things words are not for. And that's where we'll take the conversation next. The use and abuse of language, according to Confucius. Now we're going to dive into a bit deeper discussion of some of the ideas behind the passage, along with some philosophical, historical, and cultural context you should have in order to really grasp its meaning. I'm going to introduce the concept of a speech act. This idea was developed by philosophers J.L. Austin and John Searle in the 1950s and 60s, in part from one of Austin's lectures entitled How to Do Things with Words. Referring back to their analysis of how we use language will help us a lot as we work through this passage. According to Austin and Searle, there are 3 of these so-called acts associated with any spoken words, or what they call an utterance. First, there's the locutionary act, and this is the most literal level, the sounds and words being used, such as saying, "Can you pass the salt?" Second, there's the illocutionary act, and this is the intent of the words. In this case, the most likely intent is to request the salt. Then third and finally, there's the paralocutionary act. This is the effect on the listener, which may or may not be aligned with what the intent of the illocutionary act was. In this case, the effect could be that the listener passes the salt, or maybe instead of passing the salt, they get annoyed, or they respond with a question. Here's where we get if we apply these ideas to passage 15.41. Confucius believes communication is most perfect when the locutionary act aligns with the illocutionary act and elicits the speaker's desired response in the paralocutionary act. Returning to our salt passing example, if the speaker says, "Can you pass the salt?" hoping the listener will pass the salt, and then the listener passes the salt, the words chosen were appropriate. That is, these words conveyed their point. Now let's take another example. Suppose you meet someone at a party, and one of the first things they say to you is, "I'm really loving my new Bentley flying spur." What reason would this stranger have to say this to you? What's the intent of their words? Is the intent to impress, to drop a not-so-subtle hint about their wealth and life of luxury? Sure, maybe there are some contexts where it wouldn't be, but more than likely, it's bragging. And what's wrong with that? Isn't everyone allowed to brag once in a while? Well, there are contexts in which what appears to be a self-aggrandizing statement would be appropriate, and we'll get to those. But let's see why words used to brag about a new Bentley aren't words that convey their point. Remember, in the locutionary act here, the speaker states their level of enjoyment for a Bentley they recently purchased. But the speaker's illocutionary act is an attempt to impress a stranger, to make themselves more memorable, or possibly cause a feeling of attraction or jealousy. The perlocutionary act of the listener may or may not align with the illocutionary act either. The listener may be impressed, they may be annoyed, they may let out a high-pitched and prolonged fart. And it actually doesn't matter because the locutionary act and the illocutionary act are already strongly misaligned. The words themselves did not convey their point. Let's hop back into what I mentioned, those cases where apparent self-aggrandizement actually isn't so. Maybe this is a special party, one attended by a horde of so-called high net worth individuals, typical Bentley buyers. So sure, in that room, the stranger might really want to talk about the positives and negatives of the flying spur compared to whatever, the Bentley SUV. I don't know what that's called. In this scenario, locution and illocution align. That stranger just said what they mean. So maybe you're thinking to yourself, can we get back to the Analects? So let's do that. Here's this one passage that I'm thinking of, and Confucius seems crazy boastful. He says, "I've been endowed with virtue by heaven itself. What could that guy Huan Tui possibly do to me?" It just sounds super self-righteous. And you need to understand the context in order to see where it's not actually self-aggrandizement by Confucius. The context is this. This guy, Huan Tui, was hunting for Confucius, possibly with the intent to kill him. So Confucius was under threat. And with that in mind, his speech act makes perfect sense. Look at his locution. He makes the following claims. Heaven supports me. I do what is right. That's going to remain true even if someone does something wrong to me. So what is the point of killing Confucius? He's letting Huan Tui know there is no reason to take an immoral action like this. It's not going to change heaven, and it's not going to change what virtuous behavior is. He's also sending a signal to his disciples, letting them know the same. He's telling them there's nothing to fear, even if they're under threat. And if we look at the perlocution, it was aligned as well. We know that Confucius was not captured or killed by Huan Tui, and we know that his followers did not flee or abandon him. There are a lot of such speech acts in the Analects, and I'll point them out as we come to them. Usually, there are cases where you would think Confucius is exaggerating or not exactly telling the truth. But if you look at his intent, and you look at the words, and possibly look at the target of those words, you can understand why he would choose them. Often it's a challenge or hyperbole to get people to think about the state of the world. So next, I'm going to shift focus and talk about a topic that we're sure to come back to time after time. This is one of the real classics from Tim Kong's playbook, and that is the dichotomy of zhi and wen. You ever heard that saying, you can't polish a turd? That's kind of what this is all about. The way I want you to think about this, zhi means raw material, and wen means polish. Maybe you know someone who's pure gold, but nobody can tell because they're so rough on the outside. That person would have a lot of zhi, but not a whole lot of wen. Or maybe you know someone who's a real turd hidden under a thin candy coating. The fact is, even if you can't polish a turd, there's a whole lot of other ways to make one look nice. That person, probably doesn't have much zhi, but they've got a whole lot of wen. So anyway, according to Confucius, when we're born, all we have is our zhi, our raw material. As you're educated, you gain wen or polish, and that raw material gets worked into a form accentuating its better qualities. You can think of that statue of David slowly emerging from a block of marble under the hands of a master craftsman. But Confucius stresses balance in all things, and Analects 6.18 explains the problem with having too much refinement or too much raw material. Too raw, and you'll come off as rustic, uncultured. Too refined, and you'll seem pedantic. I'm sure you got the picture. The last thing I want you to know about this wen-zhi dichotomy, before we tie things back to 15.41, is that Confucius's take on which one was more dangerous is very clear. He definitely fell on the side of favoring zhi. Confucius repeatedly warned that people who were highly educated but lacked a strong foundation were particularly dangerous. Pedantry was the least of the risks. His world was overflowing with deceptive rulers and faux wise men, sophists, none of whom actually cared about helping anyone but themselves. And he urged his students to exercise caution when dealing with those who use such clever words. So let's wrap up this section. With too much wen, Confucius worried you'd be tempted to use words in a way that don't convey their point. You might end up like that guy from our first example, trying to impress everyone talking about your Bentley. Or worse, you might trick 1,000 people into thinking you're a god and that they should move to South America with you and drink poison Kool-Aid. On the other hand, if you have too much zhi, you might not end up making a whole lot of friends or getting ahead in life, but at least your words will mostly match your intentions. Next, let's discuss the language in this passage. We're dealing with just 5 characters, zi, da, and er yi yi. I'm going to discuss them in 3 chunks. First, zi, or up to this point, we have rendered as words or language. Second, da, which up to now has been rendered as conveying their point. And finally, er yi yi, which is roughly, and that's all. Zi still shows up in modern Chinese, but it's fairly rare, and it's pretty disconnected from the meaning that we see in this passage. Zi, for example, means to resign from a job. Well, I found that one out the hard way once. But if we look at some of the oldest uses of zi, even pre-Confucius, we get a better sense about what exact type of language zi refers to. The I Ching, or the ancient Chinese divination manual known as the Book of Changes, contains many of these yaozi, or textual commentaries on the individual hexagram images. The hexagrams are those 6-row diagrams that constitute the individual elements of the I Ching. And these yaozi are statements concerning their auspicious or ominous nature. So with that in mind, zi, it's really not just words or language. It's more like formal statements, comments, or testimony regarding a topic. Next up is da. This is absolutely one of my favorite characters in the Analects, and it's one that commonly gets misinterpreted. In fact, even though we've been translating it as conveying a point up to now, that's one very specific meaning, and not quite what it tends to mean in the Analects. Confucius calls one of his disciples da somewhat frequently, indicating that this is a quality or a trait that an individual can have. And many translators render da as accomplished or talented, But as Pei Min Ni explains, these things are the result of Da. They're not Da itself. So instead, he renders Da as unblocked. This makes a whole lot of sense to me as a tech guy who's constantly talking about being blocked or getting someone unblocked. But you might be wondering what it means for someone to be unblocked. Well, to me, it means they know how to get things done. They don't let things get in their way, and they're good at solving problems. And this is the same quality in a person as it is with words. So whether it's words or a person, Da is bridging a gap, it's making a connection, and it's reaching a goal. Da actually shows up a fair amount in modern Chinese. A common travel phrase you'll hear is 达到目的地, or having reached a destination. But Da-ren is a master of some sort, not to be confused with a Da-ren, tone 4 Da, big, meaning Lord. And these days, if you hear people talk about something like a 美食达人, that's come to mean something like a foodie or gourmet. It's also not an uncommon character to be used in a baby boy's given name. Finally, this 而已矣, for all you classical Chinese nerds out there, this is the first time we're going to be talking about 虚词, or literally empty words in the Analects. I just think this is a terrible name, though, because these words are anything but empty. They just don't have concrete meaning. They tend to express moods, inflections, tenses, and so forth. This 而已, you probably already know. It means the same thing in modern Chinese as it does in classical Chinese. Something like, that's all. But this 已, I'll admit, it's got about 10 different meanings. So, if you need to fall asleep, try reading them all in Du's Handbook of Classical Chinese Grammar. It's about as much fun as trying to distinguish all those usages of law. But here, it's basically saying something like full stop or period. It's adding emphasis to that's all. That's absolutely it. We're going to come back and see other instances of 已 popping up. And you'll see all the heavy lifting that these 虚词 can do. I want to wrap up this episode by reflecting on whether or not my words are conveying their point. The extended locutionary act that is this podcast, what is the point? Well, it's right up there at the start of each episode. The Analects has taught me a ton. There's not a day that goes by without a passage or two popping into my head as I work and live my life. And I want the same for you. I want to get you thinking about how to live your life. How do you interact with people? How do you communicate with them? How do you show them you care? How do you move through the world, respond to the unknown, or understand a stranger? If these podcasts are getting you to think about those questions, even if you don't agree with the ideas presented, which, by the way, is by no means the goal, then my locution, my illocution, and your perlocution are closely aligned. In that case, I'd say my words convey their point, and I'll leave it at that. Again, this is your host, Elliot Bernstein. I hope you enjoyed this 4th episode of Exploring the Analects. Next, we'll read 4.25, a 6-character passage about Confucius's favorite neighborhood. See you there.